So the Biden administration's Federal Trade Commission had a stinging defeat in their effort to block the Microsoft acquisition of Activision. Does that mean that they should back down on their efforts to enforce the antitrust laws? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So Lina Khan is the chair of the Federal Trade Commission appointed by President Biden. And according to the New York Times, her approach, an aggressive one in addressing antitrust law, is raising questions as a result of this recent defeat. Khan's background is as an academic, like me. As a Yale law student, she wrote an article for the Yale Law Review that talked about Amazon and how, despite the fact that overall Amazon reduces costs for consumers, and in some ways is really a big benefit to consumers in many ways, that it has become too big and is actually exerting monopoly power. I described this situation to my students, actually. And the best example of this has to do with the publishing industry and the marketplace, where Amazon at this point is so big and so powerful in those industries that they literally can set the price that they're willing to pay for things. It's what we actually call a monopsony, where you are such a big purchaser of things that you can set the price. Amazon's smart enough to know that they need to still give consumers a good deal, but the place that they exert their monopoly or monopsony power is on the buying side, where they're doing business with suppliers, and they can basically tell them, sell to us at the price we want, or we won't do business with you. Leaving publishers, for example, with no options. It's why Hachette at one point, one of the largest publishers in the country, has acquired a number of other publishers, trying to essentially consolidate their power so they're able to counterbalance Amazon. And it's also why Amazon and Hachette engaged in a big price war, which ultimately was resolved basically with Hachette giving all the power back to Amazon. Because again, they really have no ability to counter the power that Amazon has. And that's the fact that Lina Khan was pointing out, which is that just because consumers are getting good prices doesn't mean that we're not suffering as a result of monopoly power and antitrust activity. One thing that's become clear is that over the past few years, American industry has consolidated amazingly. In fact, research has shown that in the United States, the top 1% of companies control 97% of corporate assets, which means that the 99% out there only have 3%. So it just shows how much things have consolidated. And you can see from these graphs that this has been a steadily increasing process over time. I mean, you have to remember the last time Congress actually passed an antitrust law was back in 1950, when it passed the Seller-Kefauver Act. And the key legislation that is still the basis of legal enforcement are the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act, both of which date back to the turn of the century. And by turn of the century, I mean the 20th century. The problem has been that courts have basically taken it upon themselves to rewrite the ground rules of these laws because Congress hasn't stepped in for so long. And basically what they've done is made it where the government must prove an almost impossible standard to be able to prevail in an antitrust action. That's the issue that Lina Khan is trying to address. I mean, we're able to send people to prison for the rest of their lives or even death row based upon circumstantial evidence. But the judge in the Microsoft case said that the government hadn't produced any evidence, any smoking guns, to show that the Microsoft claim that they would continue to make the games from Activision available to consumers of other gaming platforms would not be complied with. I mean, here's the key point that the FTC was arguing, which is that currently Microsoft is 4th in the gaming industry and Activision Blizzard is number 8. Now you might think gaming, not such a big deal, but in actuality, this is now a major entertainment industry, larger than books or music, for example. The basis for Microsoft's position in this is its Xbox console. Activision Blizzard's big success is Call of Duty. The number 2 company is Sony, which of course has PlayStation. And Activision has made Call of Duty available both for Xbox and the Sony PlayStation consoles. Now, given that Call of Duty is one of the most popular franchises out there. If Microsoft were to decide that it's no longer going to make it available for the PlayStation, that would give them a huge competitive advantage over Sony in selling their Xbox consoles over the PlayStation. That's the concern that was raised by Lina Khan and the FTC. And when you look at the revenues here on this chart, it shows that combining Microsoft and Activision would result in those two companies leapfrogging over Apple and Sony to become the number 2 company in the gaming space. And I think it's worth noting before we say, oh, but there's still this other company, Tencent, which is above them, much larger, in fact, in this space. But they don't really compete with them. They're more in the internet games. For example, their big involvement here in the United States would be with Fortnite, where they own 40% of the company that produces that. But to just give you a sense of perspective, for those old folks like me, Nintendo, which makes like Mario and made the Game Boy that I remember back when I was younger, they're in the number 9 position, right behind Activision. Now, Microsoft, for their part, said, oh, don't worry, we're going to still allow PlayStation users access to Call of Duty for at least 10 years after the deal closes. And the judge's position was, well, the government couldn't produce any evidence to counter that. But yet, come on, folks, have a little bit of a sense of perspective here. Are we really going to just hand that much power over to Microsoft? And how are we really going to enforce it if at some point they decide they're not going to offer Call of Duty for the PlayStation anymore? That's the point that the FTC was making, is that sometimes there isn't some smoking gun. Sometimes you have to be able to put together a case of circumstantial evidence. And while that might be enough to convict a criminal, it's not enough to stop a merger or acquisition in the United States today. Well, you might wonder why I'm making such a big deal out of it in this video. And the reason I am is I feel it's important to add a voice saying that Lina Khan and the FTC and President Biden should not back down on their efforts to address the consolidation of business. This is a big problem, and it's been shown that it costs consumers at least $5,000 a year because of the fact that industry is so consolidated. I mean, a perfect example would be, say, your cable company. How do you feel about your cable company? If you don't like it, probably because they have a monopoly. So I think it's important for us progressives to stand up and continue saying, keep going with this type of aggressive action. The conservatives worked for years, starting in the 1970s, to be able to change the law. And in fact, President Reagan's nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court, Robert Bork, was an early advocate of changing the law to make it harder for the government to stop mergers and acquisitions. And since then, we've seen incredible consolidation in the industry. As a result, we need to encourage Lina Khan, the FTC, and President Biden to continue with these efforts, because the only hope we have of eventually changing these laws is to continue picking away at it and not backing down simply because one loss seems discouraging. Well, if you want to see just how greedy some business people have become and how they've used the power that they have in our society to rig the system to benefit themselves, check out this video over here. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.